you so much. Our next speaker is Mark Lichtenstein. Hope I'm pronouncing it
Pronounce
well.
better than I do, actually. It was spelled wrong up there, though, but that's okay.
That's my fault.
But I got introduced last week as Mary Lichtenstein, so that's a lot better.
What's that?
So you are the
My wife.
Chief Sustainability Officer at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, and you're not using slides, correct?
Thank you.
What is yours?
Thanks for the shout out for ESF. Push this back a little bit. Don't look at what's behind the curtain up there. First, let me tell you a little bit about my bios in the program. I'm not going to go through all of that, but I've been working in Puerto Rico since 2009, mostly on solid waste issues. So I want you to think about that as my context. Because solid waste management is really a proxy for a lot of sustainability issues, including energy. So keep that in mind. But before I go forward, I want to get a feel for who you are. So how many people here are actually from universities? Great, okay. I don't care about the rest of you, that's all. What about people that are from Puerto Rico? And of that group, how many went through Maria? Okay, so these are the people that have the knowledge in the room, not me. And I actually want to try to change the context here a little bit so that we can think about what we're going to be doing in these cohort discussions later on. So I also want to ask you this. There is definitely more expertise out there than there is up here, and on our panel you've already heard from some great people. How many people attended the Rocky Mountain Institute and the Resilient Power for Puerto Rico event that was held last week? 2. All right, so you guys should come up here and do this talk. But we do want to, I'm going to turn to you both later, I think we should, to talk about what that group has been doing, because that's a very important group. Talking about building a low-carbon future, not just for Puerto Rico, but for the islands in general. So my remarks are couched more as prompts for our development of this RISE platform that we've heard about for the cohort discussion. So let's go back to kind of the tagline for the conference, how higher education can strengthen preparedness, response, and recovery. So please think about that, and when we get to the Q&A, we'd like to engage you in some discussion around that. So my task is to talk a little bit about universities as drivers and centers of resiliency. The SUNY Chancellor, our boss this morning, Chancellor Johnson, talked about this in the sense of convening the academy and developing networks of community resilience. So I want to talk about a specific thing that's been going on. It started at Climate Week in New York City. How many of you have heard about the University Global Compact effort that's happening? Okay, 1 or 2. All right, so this is really important. So this is a global platform for higher ed in partnership with the United Nations, Bloomberg, I think the Ford Foundation and others, to utilize and accelerate action towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and to align everything at universities intentionally with SDGs, everything. I'm not quite sure what that means, but that was a purposeful use of that term. It was about fostering conversations that lead to game-changing, perhaps radical action. We heard that this morning from a couple of speakers, the need for that. A recognition of how essential it is for universities to play a role in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. It's typically been nation states that we think are responsible for that. But this group of universities in the United Nations is looking at universities to help do that. And it's about promoting connectivity. So I don't know if you're familiar with the SDGs, but can anybody tell me what SDG 7 is? You don't have to get the wording perfect. Hint, hint, has something to do with this panel. Okay, clean and affordable energy. So I facilitated that discussion in a group with many other academics from around the country. We came out with 3 recommendations. So I'm going to pose these to you to think about, and think about asking questions back to us. And think about it in the terms of a unique island community type situations. Number 1, we came up with, now again, this is the role that universities can play in advancing that SDG, what universities can do. Number 1, foster development of comprehensive regional energy hubs at universities. We become the energy hubs. The boundaries of the region are socioeconomic, regulatory, geographic, be any of the above. This is about using our leadership and research and development to strategize. And it's about creating convening and convergent space, including bringing in the community. I'm going to get back to that important concept. We've heard it all morning. It's about creating demonstration sites at our universities to develop best practices. It's about finance and investment strategies. It's about creating incubator space, hubs of entrepreneurship, and it's about us providing electricity at our universities back to the grid and to the communities in which our institutions reside, particularly in social and environmental justice communities. Number 2, focus on energy literacy across cohorts and advance clean energy workforce development pipeline. That's something that we're doing at ESF with SUNY leading kind of the tip of the sword on that for our chancellor. We're just starting out with that. But think about that. We heard that, I think, just one of the speakers before, the importance of education, but in energy literacy across all cohorts of people. Number 3, pose and then address aspirational grand challenges. Cecilio redefined those for us this morning, but this is about facilitating towards a just transition. It's about decarbonizing the entire supply chain, us as a university playing that role for all of our vendors up and down the supply chain. And it's about being a rapid response mechanism in a post-disaster situation. Can a university be rapid? I'm not sure. All right, let me just end with a couple other things about Vieques. Vieques is a place that I spent most of my time when I go to Puerto Rico. How many of you have heard of Vieques? I know at least one. Okay. Vieques is a special place. It's a microcosm, and it's exemplar of what we've been talking about here today, or what can be. It's an exemplar of the role of the civil society being a space for collective action around shared interests. I want to recognize Mark Martin in the front row. Mark, could you put your hand up again? He actually should be doing this talk. I'm serious about that. I would like, Mark, for you to feel free later on to talk about what will it take on Vieques, an island of 22 miles long and 3.5 miles wide, to transition to renewable. You know, you and I talked about this till 11:30 last night, and I'm not using any of the stuff you told me to use, by the way, so I appreciate the talk, though, but no, I am. All right, so Cecilio talks about communities in the sense of disaster-stricken communities become invisible, local expertise non-existent, and institutional and organizational incapacities are suddenly forgotten or simply unimportant. And that's what I think we saw happen in Vieques. But people like Mark and others stepped up and saved people's lives, literally saved their lives. Civil society created a group called Vieques Love that's now leading in a lot of these areas because of the organizational incapacities suddenly forgotten or simply unimportant. Dr. Colon just now said community became the survival unit, and no place was that more evident, in my opinion, than Vieques. The Rocky Mountain Institute last week talked about the involvement of cooperatives and municipalities in the energy transition. We just heard about that. Mark, you were kind of shaking your head no about that. I'd be interested to see what kind of disruption we get over that concept. And Cecilio said, listen to our communities to understand what resiliency means. They are showing us every day. They are repositories of non-scientific wisdom. So let me just end with this quote that Cecilio shared with some of us to get ready for RISE. Communities are tight-knitted meshes of vulnerability, radars and nodes of interconnected collaboratories nationwide. He's talking about universities, sorry. Encouraging the convergence of knowledge, technology, community wisdom, and experience with an ethically and justly modeled governance structure that interconnects with all sectors of society. This is about the RISE platform. If we can then develop observatories and we are able to affect governmental agency behavior, private industry behavior, and most importantly, the behavior of our own universities, we can save lives by lowering the length of recovery and reconstruction periods, empowering communities as producers of their own knowledge and not just being consumers of manufactured ignorance. This is about being disruptive of the status quo. Don't be confused about that. Thanks.
And our last speaker today is Dr. Jeff Friedman from the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. I work with Jeff, and he's going to remind us that one energy source in Puerto Rico should not be overlooked, and it's wind energy. So Jeff.
Thank you everyone for being here this afternoon, and welcome to Renewable Open. This is November. Okay? And so actually this is not atypical. Anyway, what I want to talk about briefly here is that there is a really, and we're going to switch a little to science now, a little more science-based talk in terms of meteorology. Research. And most of my work over the last few years has involved wind energy, boundary layer meteorology. And one thing that I've always wondered about is why certain places on the planet don't have as much wind energy or not taking advantage of the wind energy as they should. And we'll talk about that in the context of Puerto Rico as we go along. And so what I'd like to point out, this is basic meteorology 101, is that Puerto Rico lies within the trade winds. These are the most persistent winds on the planet. Everybody's been down to Puerto Rico or any kind of island within the subtropics. It's persistently windy, especially at the coast. The added benefit of the trade winds is that typically winds do increase as you go up in the atmosphere. And that's true in the trades, but the maximum wind speed you'll find in the trade winds is much closer to the surface than you will find around here. So you just go up several hundred feet, and that's where the highest wind speeds are going to be. And as it turns out, the state that has the highest penetration of renewables also lies in the subtropics and in the trade winds, and that would be, of course, Hawaii. In fact, to the point where they generate more power from renewables than they need, to the point where they have a negative load. And that's the problem they're grappling with. And so, Puerto Rico, as you can see here, this is just a snapshot I took just a couple of days ago. And you can see these persistent winds, and I could probably do this 90% of the time, any day of the year, and that's what you'll find. These are the surface winds here, just flowing out of the northeast, and steady base. So, what's the wind resource like? Now, I went looking around and to see we had wind resource maps all over the world, actually. And I worked when I was at AWS True Power in developing these maps for the U.S. and other parts of the offshore waters, onshore waters. And this is something that the National Renewable Energy Lab did with, actually, as it turns out, probably with input from us, for a map for Puerto Rico. And this is for 100-meter wind speeds. These are where you're going to find your typical hub heights now for your wind turbines. And those colors that you see in reds and as you go out into the purples represent good to excellent wind speeds. In other words, really good for the wind resource. You'll see that on the island itself. I guess what we can do here is, on the island itself, you do see that on the higher terrain, you do get some very good winds. But I'll point out, especially in the offshore waters, that there's a really terrific resource. On the island, you can get probably, if you build out everywhere with exclusion zones, in other words, we don't want to build in areas where there's no transmission or areas where there's national parks or very environmentally sensitive lands. You can probably build out to 2,500 to 3,000 megawatts. Good amount of electricity for an island that really needs about 4,500 to 5,000 megawatts. Okay, offshore waters is a tremendous resource, but what's the problem that you face with offshore in Puerto Rico? Anybody know? There's a big trench. It's really deep water just offshore. It's the same problem you have in Hawaii. These are islands that basically don't stop at the surface. They keep going down into really deep trenches. Puerto Rican trench is well over 20,000 feet deep. But it's doable. There's new technologies coming on. Now, there are operating wind farms on Puerto Rico. The first one I brought up is not operating right now. That took a direct hit from Maria. And so they are in the midst of, I think, insurance litigation, trying to get that repowered. But not too far to the southwest is the largest wind farm in the Caribbean, and that basically suffered little or no damage, and is still operating. And so that's good news. In other words, yeah, you get a direct hit from a Category 5 hurricane, bad things are going to happen. You design these facilities for Category Cat 3 storms, and then insurance will take care of the rest, you hope. Cat 4, Cat 5 storms are very rare occurrences. Okay.
It helps if you feather blades.
Well, you do feather the blades. What happened there was, yes, yeah, that's, I don't understand that. That's just something I don't understand. I'm sorry. Okay, now, part of the equation that we have to deal with, and this was touched upon, is cost. What does it cost? What does electricity cost in Puerto Rico? And it turns out it's an island, so it costs a lot more. Hawaii actually is costing even higher, which is why they're so far ahead in terms of that. Hawaii costs 4 times what they are in the continental U.S. And you can see, this is the latest cost that, what's interesting to me is that commercial and industrial costs are so much higher compared with what you would expect that ratio to be elsewhere. And so this is another driver because, as it turns out, the big problem you have is that energy mix right now. So you can see natural gas, petroleum, right? We got to import everything. Everything has to be imported. And so finally, you can see that wind and solar are a small part of that mix. You get wind and solar up and you'll be able to take advantage of things like this. The fact that your costs, these are the levelized costs of energy, these are the latest figures. And that you can see wind here is pretty much compared to every generation source. And that's even combined cycle natural gas. Wind is competitive. In fact, in some places in this country, it's cheaper. And solar is also up here, also very cheap. Offshore wind is a bit more expensive. Those costs are coming down rapidly. And to give you an idea, whoops, I have to do that. That's looking at wind. Sort of, you can see how rapidly wind energy costs are increasing. These are levelized costs of energy. This is unsubsidized cost of energy. So we're going to take away the production tax credit over the next few years. And it's still going to be one of the cheapest sources of energy, and it's going to get cheaper in time. Solar, of course, is also probably as cheap as wind will be at this particular time. So what I'll do is I'll leave you with that. And any questions, please fire away.
So we have a good 40 minutes. 35, 40 minutes, so I would like to invite our panelists back up here. And I'd like first to open the floor to any pressing question to any of the panelists. That panel was about challenges, so did we miss any important challenge? Or was something being said not clear? Okay?
Should I go to the microphone?
Yes, yeah, it would be the best thing if you can go there.
Hi everyone. Is this on? So my name is Santiago. I work with community and environmental groups that are part of a civil society initiative called Queremos Sol. We want sun. And so one of the things we're doing is participating actively in what is known as the Integrated Resource Plan for the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. And we have found, Siemens Industries is the consultant on that. They, in the various versions of the plan, which is still in draft form, they indicate that the per unit cost of customer-owned alternatives, customer-owned generation, I should say, is always lower than any of the alternatives or any of the rates that PREPA would ultimately charge in the IRP, and any of the preferred plans. And so I'm wondering whether you can comment on that and whether, and the transmission aspect of that. So we know that the rooftop solar, for example, which is basically what customer-owned generation is, it does away in large measure with the transmission costs and investments. Yet the outcome of the plan doesn't go that way, in spite of the fact that they admit that customer-owned generation is the cheapest option. So if you can comment on that. Thank you.
Well, you opened up the universal question about customer versus utility-generated power, not only in Puerto Rico, but it's crucial there. Any of the panelists want to answer that directly?
Yeah, it's Ruth, thanks for the question. Ruth and I have been on a panel or two in the past as well. You're absolutely right. I mean, all I can say is they're probably forced to make other considerations. So if you move too quickly toward basically stepping off the grid, costs end up falling more heavily on the poor, because when you talk about customer-owned generation, what they're really thinking of is industrial, commercial, large-scale, CHP, solar, could be anything powered. That transfers costs. They're trying to argue for a stepped approach, and yes, they want to see more gas come on because that's something that they understand, and it makes them feel comfortable. So, thanks for the pushback on that. But in most cases, yes, you eliminate the transmission, you look at the customer-owned generation, specifically when you're talking about solar as a mainstay, solar and storage, where those prices have come down. It's going to be less expensive than almost anything they can forecast right now for PREPA. So despite that, if you push too quickly, then you end up with an imbalance in economic development, which they don't want to talk about. So realistically, they want to keep PREPA, they want to keep central generation, they want to keep a balance of economic development so that you don't see too many large industrials or other people exiting the grid too quickly, which is why they want to keep it centralized. That's more of a political answer.
Yeah, I can answer a little bit too. I mean, the trade-off is obviously transmission versus efficiency. The customer-owned facilities are generally not as efficient, and that's what the industry would tell you. I think that's going to change, though, if we really develop our ability to store energy. I think that'll be the game changer, and then it'll be an open and shut case.
In the back, yeah.
I think I can speak about
Okay.
this. I don't know if the last question is exactly what I'm going to ask, but the way I think about this, as in the more aggressive scenario, ideal and so on, as the combined energy portfolio, so to speak, moves to renewables or whatever it is that's going away from the grid, from the conventional grid, who has model or what sense do we have of what happens to the conventional grid and its cost and its sustainability? And because we cannot shut the grid down, right? We need that. There's no way. And the singularity is that this grid is also down, right? What happens to the cost of that grid and maybe other social dislocations as the demand is going to be decreasing? And I suppose the faster that happens, the more shocks it produces.
That's perfect question. I'm going to just do a technical answer and then I'll let you to the regulatory part. So and it boils into the customer thing. So first about the customer, it may be the cheapest solution for some customers, but we have to realize that many customers cannot be generating. Like you go in the cities, there is no space, industries, space restricted, so, and you're talking to a self-generating customer. I've been self-generating on my house for 25 years and really happy with it. I go through outages and all the like, but I realized when I look at Queens or Brooklyn, New York, they just cannot do what I do in my house. I'm driving a solar car, electric car that I power with the sun. So to go back to the grid, the grid is indispensable to 100% renewable, and there is no way around it. The good thing is that the way the new solutions about renewables, you could have almost a seamless replacement of fossil-based generation without having to totally re-engineer the grid, except for it to be capable of being resilient when it needs to be resilient. That's the big missing thing in the grid. That's what we should focus on. But as far as integrating renewable to the grid needs to be there, and we just cannot do away with it. People are not going to cut the cord and move away from it. They cannot all do that.
If I can clarify, I don't mean the technical aspect,
Yeah.
I mean the economic aspect.
Yeah, so
That's, this is a lot of the area that we deal in. And that becomes a question of how do you handle issues like grid defection and this rapid change, which could significantly impact populations that either don't have the resources to invest or don't have, well, let's put it this way, they don't have the monetary resources, or they may not have access to the solar insulation or whatever. So, just kind of supporting what Richard said, one of the things we clearly have to do is really focus on, and we've written a little bit about this, what we call a DER amenable grid. That is, we have to make the grid as much as possible incorporating distributed energy as an active and dynamic asset. And it's really important that we do this from the start, because grid investments are very long-lived. The depreciation, the asset depreciation life of these investments is 28 to 40 years. So you make a capital investment in the transmission system, and that's going to sit there depreciating for 40 years. And in a regulated industry, they get paid for that no matter what. Or you have what's called stranded costs. So these are some of the issues that we worry about. How do you build that grid in a way and ensure that it's DER amenable? Secondly, how do you set the rates in a way that the transition is fair? I mentioned grid defection. Those that have the most can most afford grid defection. And one of the things that we also wrote about was what we were calling gated microgrids. Those customers who can afford a microgrid will build their microgrid, they'll leave. The rest of the costs are then imposed on the remaining ratepayers. And I don't know who attributed this to, but I remember hearing, I think Richard Kaufman, our energy czar, used to talk about what he called the Aunt Millie problem. This having to do with telecommunications. Everybody leaves the old landline system, and the only person left paying is Aunt Millie, because she didn't get her cell phone. So all the costs are imposed on Aunt Millie, the so-called Aunt Millie problem. So these are the areas that we think regulatory frameworks, the smart design of incentives and rate structures is really critical so that you can try to mitigate these potential poor outcomes.
Yeah, actually, just one point to add is Tom and I have been working for about a year talking about these things. And the thing that you need to know in Puerto Rico is that basically they're doing everything right now, right? There was no regulator until 5 years ago, and it wasn't really a regulator until a year or so ago, or less, really, when the legislation passed in March. So they have a list of things that the law says you must do in 6 months. And so there's a number of hearings going on. It has been generally productive. The commissioners are thoughtful and really they want to do their best, but they're definitely a bit overwhelming here. And a lot of these things are going on, and there's a lot of box ticking sort of happening. It's like, oh, we had a hearing on this, we did this. So instead of looking at a rate case, and you may see here, or considering can we allow more renewables onto the grid, and how should we think about this and engaging in study? They're doing the integrated resource plan, right? But this is the big bun fight, and this is what Ruth was talking about in terms of how do we set the standard for what we expect to accomplish in the next 5 or 10 years, right? Like any battle plan is going to fall apart as soon as it meets the enemy, but you got to have a plan to start with. In addition to that, they're looking at renewable resources, efficiency, and the one that really plays most on this is the grid resources hearings. And so these have been going on at the same time. And it's really in the grid resources where you're talking about, well, how do we get to these things we're talking about in the IRP or the law? How do we get to, and how many different micro regions are we going to create? And what does that mean in terms of infrastructure? How long is a piece of string question is what these guys are trying to answer right now. And so this is all happening. So don't expect a lot of talk. There's a lot of vision here, but there's a lot of work, and there's not a lot of expertise. So we've been supporting different groups. I had a meeting with the commissioners to talk specifically about microgrids and infrastructure for payment and data and other things with a couple of companies last week. So they're open, but there's going to be a lot of work to do.
Can I just comment? I think one thing that people always have to remember about energy is the goalposts are always being moved. So it's very, very difficult to make any kind of a long-term plan, given technological developments, changes in various energy costs associated with different sources of energy, et cetera. Really is a challenge.
Question over there? Left.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Marcel Castro Cipiriche, and I work at the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. And I think that we're still talking about the past here, because we're talking about the grid, and we're talking about, you mentioned economic stability in terms of a transition. People do not need a grid. There's no need for a grid. People need electricity. Right? In the past, it was impossible without a grid, but that's not true right now. And there's economic cost today that was done by a colleague that worked with us, that it costs 21.6 cents per kilowatt hour. The levelized cost of electricity is similar to the Lazard analysis, and the cost from PREPA is 22 cents. So it's already today, without further reduction in cost, to have a cost effective at the house. The issue is finance, because not everybody can afford, but everybody can afford 22 cents because that's what we're paying. Poor people are paying 22 cents. So the issue of the people left behind is an issue of finance. And if we don't start talking about electricity and we put the grid first as a priority, it's hard to focus on the people that survive without electricity for 5 months. So if you tell the people that were the 200,000 families that were 5 months without electricity, that there is a need to strengthen the grid, but the grid is still going to fail even with the mini grids for them, then we're not focusing in that customer side. So I don't think there is a debate customer side, utility side, because we don't need a utility. We need electricity, and we need to find the best way to get electricity to the people so we can survive and still live well. And I know this is like a long-term debate, but I feel like we still not focus on the right, on the sweet spot of the people, the quality of life. And maybe a grid, take a step back, maybe a grid, it has a place in it, because we already have it built, even though we owe it, is debt. But there's also 20 billion expected in investment. Where are those going to go? To strengthen the grid, or to empower the communities to produce their own power in their rooftop? And that's a major thing to consider. Right?
If I just can comment on that, it's super important what you say, as long as you're talking about customers who have a roof to deploy that. I'd say even in Puerto Rico, not all the customers have the opportunity to deploy it on their premises. So when I think of my own system on my home, I have the room, I have everything, I have drive a solar car powered by PV, but then I look at the Bronx, New York, and I know they cannot do that. There is no way, there is no space to do it. So
That's why mapping.
those customers have to be taken care of, and the grid will be important for those.
It's a small minority.
But that's a two-headed solution. That part is really important. I wish that every
But it's very small minority.